Dr. Jim Linville is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Lethbridge, where his main field of study is the Hebrew Bible. You can find his blog at drjimsthinkingshop.com.
I'd like to thank Marlo Filipov, Shauna Watson, Evan Frank, and all the other organizers for the invitation to speak here, and for all the work that they put into what is probably going to be their last CFI gathering, given this one's eschatological theme. My own talk really doesn't fit that theme, but it should make you long for the end of the world, and so that's fine. And I'm quite honored to be on the bill alongside Eugenie Scott and the closet cat lover, P.Z. Myers, and all the other presenters. So I made that for P.Z. Now, since we're on the eve of destruction, I should confess a sin. A few parts of this presentation have been plagiarized from some other talks I've given in the past. I'm trying to work all this out loud into a book. Just in case the apocalypse is postponed again, I need to think of my retirement fund. But speaking of books, let's begin with the source of all wisdom, the internet. A certain fellow who calls himself Robster claims that the great atheists, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, have identified the, quote, idiocy and profound nonsense in the Bible's fables, which you would expect from Bronze Age nomadic, illiterate goat herders. Their stories made up to provide some sort of dodgy foundation for those tainted by religion to hang their coattails. A patron of Dawkins' online forum said this, quote, the only alleged evidence in support of creationism is comprised of the myths, superstitions, fairy tales, fantastical delusions that arose from the sun-baked brains of an ignorant gaggle of Bronze Age fishermen and peripatetic, militant, marauding, genocidal goat herders. To another patron, the goat herders were ignorant and incestuous. Elsewhere we learn they're from the Stone Age. Another clever soul has renamed the Christian Bible to this: the Bronze Age Goat Herders Anthology of Campfire Tales for Boys, God's Little Instruction Manual for Handling Slaves, Sex Slaves, Kitchen Help, Naughty Offspring, Babysitters, and soon-to-be extinct tribes next door. Now with the egomaniacal hippie and his all-boy posse hang out in Palestine. Lest we think this is simply an internet phenomenon, in The Greatest Show on Earth, Dawkins himself comments on the, quote, origin myth of a particular set of Bronze Age desert tribesmen, end quote. I hope you're beginning to see a bit of a pattern here. Now, I presented this same information to the Society of Biblical Literature meeting in Chicago 2 weeks ago. Many of my academic colleagues wondered what it is about goat herders that get atheist goats. The Goat Herders Union has been alerted, but for my part, let me make 3 points about this whole goat age business. First, it's wrong about the Bronze Age. Second, it's wrong about the goats. And third, being right about the origins of the Bible would probably only help the secular movement in the long run. Now, it's my job at the University of Lethbridge to add a few drops into the bucket of knowledge about human cultures, histories, their religions, and so forth. I choose to study ancient people primarily because they can't sue me, right? But I do live in the modern world, and I retain the right to free speech and secular activism. And I can't see the wisdom of having our political, educational, moral, and scientific issues determined by self-serving and ever-shifting interpretations of a fuzzy collection of ancient texts. And these interpretations made by self-professed experts on purportedly divine truths. Yet I see a major disjunction between what I know about the Bible and religiosity and what most of the influential secular writers, primarily the so-called New Atheists, have to say about these matters. And so in my title, by reclaiming the Bible, I mean to naturalize it as part of human history, and not to idolize or vilify it. I do not mean to soften modern critique of religion, but to highlight the sometimes silly mistakes about the Bible and religion that are frequently made, and to affirm that the humanities and social sciences are as important to secularism as are the hard sciences. My bad example will be Richard Dawkins, but I don't want to demonize him either for these errors, as some other secularists within religious studies have done. Rather, I think of this as a constructive criticism. If you want some civil and friendly help with his Bible chapter in any new edition of the God Delusion, he has only to ask. I'd be delighted. So, why is the Bronze Age wrong? Tradition says Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible at a time that corresponds to what we call the Late Bronze Age, with the entirely legendary patriarchs of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which would be placed in the early 2nd millennium BCE, and presumably wandered around after some middle-aged bronze goats. In the 19th century, however, many strands of Christian biblical scholarship were very busy getting very secular. And finally, a fully secular criticism arose that attempted to explain these biblical texts without any reference to the divine or particular difference to the Bible's own claims. And basically, a lot of these Christian critics, and all of this was going on in theological schools, talked themselves into a secular corner. In this context, Moses became regarded as a largely legendary figure. For many decades, critics looked to the reign of Solomon in the early Iron I period as a starting point for much of the now biblical writings. The large majority of biblical scholars, including many Christians, would now put the writing of the Pentateuch later in the Iron Age, perhaps late Iron II. But a minority of scholars would say even that is far too early. Indeed, some of the crowd that I hang out with says there's no reason to date the production of any of this literature in any recognizable form before the Hellenistic period. And there's no physical evidence, actual manuscripts of anything in the Old Testament until the Hasmonean period, 164 to 63 BCE. The oldest biblical texts are 2nd century BCE. So the earliest physical evidence of the biblical literature comes from about 1,000 years after the end of the Bronze Age. Now, the people who put the biblical literature together probably never herded a goat in their lives. They were scribes, the egghead scholars of the day, writing elitist literature for an elitist audience. We have about 5% literacy rate. What Terry Pratchett says of priests also goes for these temple scribes. Many feel they are called to the priesthood, Pratchett says, but what they really hear is an inner voice saying, it's indoor work with no heavy lifting. So, when folks say that the Bible is the product of Bronze Age goat herders, they are actually surrendering too darn much to the conservative religious camp about biblical origins. To put it in simpler terms, the Old Testament is not really that old. Although the book I'm writing about it will be called the Decrepit Testament. I duly note the irony. Now, were this simply a matter of correcting non-specialists, there would be no point to this presentation. But think of the inverse of how creationists badly misconstrue evolution or natural history. If we value accuracy about science, should we not value accuracy in our descriptions of religion in the Bible? To do so is not to surrender a thing to the religious. And so allow me to critique, with all good intents, the straw man argument against the Bible. I know it's a fun sort of creative dismissal of that old tome. It's rhetorical overkill that one can find in almost any kind of heated discussion about anything, and it shouldn't be taken too seriously. But behind the offhand comments is the dismissal of much more in the various books and public presentations that are taken seriously and do have a political impact. And so indulge me as I engage in my own rhetorical overkill and pontificate on the dangers of what I like to call the Bronze Age goat herder syndrome. The BAGH, or BAH syndrome, commends itself as a label, but it's a bit I can't even pronounce this, onomatopoeic for my tastes, although it's sufficiently silly. Anyway, it's a frame of mind in which the Bible, its producers are held to represent almost everything that an ideal atheistic world will not be. Rude, crude, uneducated, ignorant, perhaps willfully so, superstitious, fear-ridden, violent, racist, xenophobic, clannish, homophobic, misogynistic, unjust, and generally unpleasant. Sufferers of the syndrome do not really need to ascribe the Bible to goat herders in the Bronze Age, but they are the atheists' most popularly herded scapegoats. At this point, you might want to get the stake in the bonfire ready. But to my serious academic religious studies tainted mind, the syndrome seems to serve a mythic function. By myth, I mean a story that reflects and that influences anew a group's sense of place and identity. As such, it relegates religion to a kind of primordial fall into a religious dark age. Salvation comes from the heroic emancipatory struggles of scientists, rationalists, free thinkers, a mythic battle that must be refought again and again as the chaos of irrational faith reasserts itself in the guise of a resurgent fundamentalism, a situation that we read in many atheist writers is to be blamed on all believers, including moderates and liberals. I agree that religion is a byproduct of otherwise helpful evolutionary adaptations. It's not an adaptation in itself. But when that viewpoint turns into declarations that religion is a virus of the mind, that infects generation after generation and then poisons everything, I think we're no longer doing science or the rational analysis of human culture. We are into the realm of identity politics, affirming the boundaries of the atheist movement by creating a boogeyman out of what we are not. I mentioned I presented a paper on a related theme a few weeks ago. It was the combined meeting of the American Academy of Religion, which is dedicated to the study of any and all sides of human religiosity, and the Society of Biblical Literature. More than 10,000 scholars, apprentice scholars, hangers-on, and a few pseudo-scholars showed up in Chicago. Many of the attendees are believers in one sense or another, but a great many can and do contribute positively to the secular study of religious history, thought, and practice. But among the non-believing biblical scholars, there is a great reluctance to challenge the faithful when they're obviously doing religion and not studying it academically. Crypto or hidden theological readings of the Bible abound. While ostensibly secular, their intent is to rehabilitate or reinvent the Bible for a more egalitarian or eco-friendly era. The unfortunately close relationship between confessional and secular biblical research has been the subject of some ink over the past several years. And some of us are trying to re-secularize the SBL, and we're having some success, but it's early days. As I said, the very many believing scholars can compartmentalize their theological efforts from their academic work. Not all can, but many can. But my paper there asked the audience to consider the inverse. What should secular biblical scholarship have to do with the new atheists whose stated mission is to minimize or eliminate the cultural influence of religious belief and the Bible in the world today? I suspect the vast majority of my colleagues in the SBL would say nothing at all, including the non-believers. They would emphasize the ethics of tolerance and what they consider the ridiculous caricatures of religion in the popular atheist press. And on this last point, they have a point. The new atheists and other commentators on the Bible should really pay more attention to modern biblical scholarship. My favorite example is from the Old Testament, the horrific story of Judges 19, how a Levite, a member of the priestly clan, To save his own miserable skin, throws his wife out to a crowd to be gang raped, and she ends up murdered. The poor, unnamed woman suffers the added indignity of being dismembered by her husband and her body parts being sent to all corners of Israel to incite a civil war against her attackers. A war of terrible violence ensues, and in its aftermath, more rape. You gotta love the Brick Testament, folks. You really do. Needless to say, feminists, both within and outside of religious communities, have expended an awful lot of ink on this story to great effect, often highlighting the terrible biases in both how male commentators, both religious and secular, have treated the passage. Now, Dawkins in The God Delusion rightly notes the tale's horrific aspects, but what stands out for him are the obvious allusions in this story to another biblical story, this one in Genesis, of how two angels are taken into the home of Lot in Sodom, only to have a crowd wish to know them in the biblical sense. In this case, however, the crowd is struck blind and Lot's family make good their escape before God destroys the city. Dawkins writes, quote, "The story of the Levite's concubine is so similar to that of Lot. One can't help wondering whether a fragment of manuscript became accidentally misplaced in some long-forgotten scriptoria." End quote. Now, despite their similarities, the two stories can hardly be confused with each other. No biblical scholar could possibly get such an idea published. It is one thing to find this kind of explanation on the internet. It's another to find it in a published book by an Oxford professor. Repetition in ancient stories does not mean sloppiness in transmission. A repeated chorus in a piece of music does not mean that the conductor mixed up the pages of the score or the composer ran out of ideas ages ago. Although, considering my taste in music, that's always a possibility. Rather, look, I don't get a budget for a joke writer, okay? Talk to the dean, you will. Rather, the judge's narrative is a deliberately composed antithesis to the one in Genesis. It takes its plot lines and motifs and turns salvation and judgment into a horror story. And what is more, the horror story takes place not in a foreign city like Sodom, but an Israelite one. Surely there is a nightmare fantasy here of what society can descend into. Why do we watch horror movies? Ancient scribes often wrote with subtlety, complexity, self-reflection, imagination, and creativity. And Dawkins forgets at times that the Bible is not always in favor of the actions of its characters. But the contributors to the Bible, or like the contributors to the Bible, Dawkins is the product of his own time, and his time is marked by a great status for science. He inherits this from an intellectual tradition that goes back a long time, and certainly marks the origins of anthropology and religious studies, too. Dawkins rightly decries the monotheistic chauvinism in the proposed progression in human culture and human capacity from magic or animism to polytheism and then monotheism. In some formulations, science replaces even that. But such a progression is hardly current in religious studies or anthropology. Often not recognized by the new atheists is the secular chauvinism or science centricism of their own positions. Here is one pre-new atheist example. In the early 1970s, Jacob Bronowski hosted a BBC series called The Ascent of Man on human cultural evolution. As a teenager, I eagerly read the accompanying paperback and loved it. And I still like lots of it. But I do remember being a bit disturbed to read that the Bakhtiari herdsmen of Persia led lives without features, and that their nomadic adventure leads nowhere. of the very real possibility that the annual migration would go poorly with many animals, including goats, being lost, he says, quote, "Those are the odds of the nomad life year in, year out. And beyond that, at the end of the journey, there will still be nothing, except an immense traditional resignation," end quote. Can the people who have existed for so many hundreds of years really regard their own lives as pointless or directionless? Or is it that we can't see it because we can't imagine ourselves finding meaning in such a life without many possessions or human-made landmarks? As I was preparing this presentation, I consulted the new ebook edition of The Ascent of Man and found much to my surprise that a new foreword was written by none other than Richard Dawkins. And I thought that a fortuitous coincidence. To my mind, Bronowski's portrayal of nomadic life anticipates some of the new atheist triumphalism about science and dismissive attitudes towards religion and traditional societies. And I can detect in some of these discourses a reinforcement of the marginalization of the social sciences and humanities, often thought to fail to provide a useful knowledge in today's market-driven universities. Human cultural history should be more than a sideline to humanity as a subject of biological or medical inquiry. According to the so-called secularization theory, as Steve pointed out, with the spread of Enlightenment rationalism, growing scientific literacy, and increased standard of living, people would slough off religion as redundant. But the theory fails to explain the continuing presence and prominence of religion. Rather, the modern era has not seen so much the failure of religion, but its adaptation to a new consumer-driven, make-it-up-for-yourself mode in which the key term is spirituality and not religion per se. Indeed, many self-professed spiritual or faithful people see religion as a negative term, a social organization with no heart, no soul, or connection to the divine. Moreover, there is also a rise in conservative, anti-modernist versions of established religious formulations. It seems to many religious studies scholars that the new atheists really are not aware of the modern religious landscape. A pity, since they are making such an impression on numerous political issues. And much of this impression is quite favorable. Anyway, I'll do that. Biblical studies also has some political implications, although it seems to be that the only ones really rising to the challenge are theologically oriented ones. Certainly there is some overlap between the kind of secular world the new atheists value and the intellectual space in which secular biblical criticism takes place. For instance, Syro-Palestinian archaeologists often vociferously reject the popular title biblical archaeologist, as if the Bible is all that matters about ancient Palestine. They frequently bewail the sensationalist media reports that cater to religious conservatives. When the press needs an expert opinion on the Bible or ancient Israel, they often don't recognize that secular scholarship even exists. Many other academics make the same mistake. The purely scholarly wrangling over biblical Israel and historical Israel impacts the even more bitter arguments that accompany the intractable Israeli-Palestinian situation. As some folks I know have found out, to attack the biblical mythology that supports the state of Israel is to attract accusations of anti-Semitism and even threats of violence. But demystifying that politically charged myth is something I think scholars are obligated to do. But on the other hand, a number of Palestinian leaders say that historical Israel never existed, and they would wipe away ancient Israel to make their case that Jews have no ancient claim to the land. And I think scholars are obligated to defend against such mythologies as well. As we all know, the Old Testament plays a central role in the political wrangling over science and religion in the classroom. Various moralists affirm the Bible is the one true basis for a just society. The secular study of the Bible, then, should provide society with a resource for thinking about a number of politically charged issues. Biblical and religion scholarship should matter to secularists and the new atheists. But according to Dawkins, anthropological studies of religion amount to a catalogue of human gullibility. But as I've said elsewhere, a history of democracy, of advertising, or college students' mating rituals can do the same. The popular atheist writers regard religion as a knowable, quantifiable, and bordered entity that can be isolated from the rest of human experience and then rejected to everyone's benefit. Little attention, however, is paid by them to how people actually identify their ethnic, political, philosophical, or other boundaries through virtually identical means as they mark religious groups, sharing stories of origins, and the production of totemic icons and other symbolic edifices around themselves. And in this regard, I call attention to the big red letter A symbol on many atheists' t-shirts and websites, including my own. There is no scholarly consensus on the definition of religion, because each religious community has unique interactions between social and natural environments, intellectual and artistic traditions, political structures, economics, their history, and more. It's not a simple problem. Dictionary definitions of religion don't work. So religious studies really is more useful than you might think. Religion has more to do with belonging than believing. It is a very loose set of symbolic ways in which people continuously reconstruct their social identities and set them apart from other societies. And religions are constantly changing. Many non-believers like to juxtapose static religions claiming ultimate truths with ever-advancing and self-correcting science. But in fact, people are constantly inventing and reinventing their gods, spirits, ancestors, cosmic principles, divine laws. Professed eternal truths are products of history, circumstance, politics, creative speculation, and willful fabrication. Just like a lot of national mythology, folklore, and fake lore. But invented tradition can be very quickly considered timeless and unchanging. Religions very quickly bury the story of their own past. A real critique of religion will not play into the hands of those who believe their faith is static and God-given, but force them to confront the vagaries of their own tradition's history. That critique, however, should include explanations for why ancient Judeans, and not any other goat-herding nation from the ancient Near East, eventually developed the idea of sacred writings and scripture-based religion that has so profoundly marked the intellectual heritage of the West with all of its science and secularism. There is something to be said for telling our ancestors' tale instead of just pulling it until it hurts them. But let's give it a little wee tug. Dawkins again. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Okay, it's a subtle point, right? Damn, I wish I had written that. But we have to ask another question here. Is having a God like that really such a bad thing? Now, Yahweh began his career as a bog-standard ancient Near Eastern storm god, like Baal, another deity that many ancient Israelites worshipped. His adherents viewed him as their patron deity, an idea that was a projection of their relationship with various human kings and emperors, very few of which had any kind of sense of humor. It was a reciprocal relationship Each had obligations to the other. Kurt Knoll of Brandon University says it was a conception that easily led to the victims of military or environmental disaster being blamed for upsetting the god. That big red thing is not a goat, by the way. Anyway, Knoll writes, the society itself dictated what the patron god required, what the patron god defined as just, and whom the patron god favored. The blame the victim doctrine is one of many examples in which the patron god has become the puppet who dances to the strings of cultural demand. The great pioneering sociologist Emile Durkheim was right in saying that societies project themselves onto their invented sacred realms. But it's overly simplistic to conclude from that since the scribal elites of ancient Judah imagined a violent, unpredictable god, that they must have been particularly barbaric themselves. And in any case, one can find other biblical passages that imagine the deity as far more accommodating, life-affirming, and friendly, even to people of other nations. Is there nothing to be learned from this? The unpleasantness and contradictions found in the Bible's portrayal of Yahweh reflect one people's handling of the contradictions of life that are still with us. Are we fooling ourselves if we think that the Israelites were utterly unlike us? As we know, today's unbeliever would never vilify Muslims or Arabs, or boast of shrugging off old religious stereotypes while verbally assaulting and threatening atheist women who call attention to sexism in the atheist community. That was sarcasm. The biblical writers wrestled with capriciousness and fickleness in their deity. Biblical books like Job play havoc with the idea that God only smites the smite-worthy. Such texts are fantasies in the service of reality. The world is unkind. The Bible is not always satisfied, however, with the pat answers that excuse God or whitewash his actions. And I wish fundamentalists, as well as atheists, would be careful enough readers of the Bible to note when this seems to be happening. The Bible is a collection of diverse material. It's of more than two minds when it comes to many ethical questions, including issues like corporate guilt, in which a whole nation must bear the punishment of the sins of its leader. But we are too. Canadians such as myself have been taught since childhood to celebrate as heroes the airmen who rained thousands of tons of bombs down on the heads of German children in the Second World War. And I do think of them as heroes. We still justify and excuse or ignore. It hasn't really anything to do with religion or the Bible or believing at all. It's part of belonging. Now, I'm not proposing that we save the Bible from itself, its conservative devotees, or from the new atheists. But certainly there are more reasons to read it and teach it in a secular way than to understand illusions and imagery in literature, such as Dawkins recommends. Above all, its producers are part of the human story, and telling that story is as valid an academic social enterprise as are the hard sciences, if we really want to know who we are as a species. All of that being said, I have considerable sympathy for the New Atheists' campaign to end religious privilege. I like that one, huh? To counter the popular notion that morality is dependent on religion, and to challenge the absurd claims of creationists, of moralists preaching about biblical family values and the definition of marriage and all of that. And sometimes the new atheists get far more abuse from other secular scholars than they deserve, and sometimes they get more from secularists than from believers. For instance, in the process of arguing for a strong separation between the study and practice of religion and the Society of Biblical Literature, secularist and biblical scholar Jacques Berliner-Blau writes, quote, "The tendency of today's celebrities of non-belief to depict theistic thinkers as dupes and imbeciles actually exemplifies the cultural impoverishment and desperation of today's free-thinking movements. Secular intellectual culture is moored in the 90s, and by this I mean the 1890s. A more serious engagement with religious thought would serve it well. Similarly, R. Joseph Hoffman frequently castigates the new atheists, including Professor Myers, who's talking upstairs, for dumbing down secularism and atheism. Treating the new atheists as imbeciles may be an act of desperation itself, and it really is self-defeating. And so, if the new atheists and their huge audiences are a little short-sighted about the Bible or religion, I think I'm obligated to speak up and pitch in to help, since I share so many of their goals. In short, I take my cue from the wisdom of that quintessential Canadian philosopher. As he says, we're all in this together. And so, I'll leave you with this. If the world is to be made a better place by making it less overtly religious, then how do we look at religion and various religions as products of human culture? But if secular biblical criticism and religious studies can contribute to a better alternative, we need to know how best to do that and how to get academics to value contributing. And we have to ask, how do we get other people to pay attention to it? Thank you.
I really enjoyed that discussion. It seemed to be focused more on Christianity as opposed to, say, Buddhism, or I think maybe more of the Muslim religious texts, which are derivative, I suppose, from Moses' text. So, I mean, is that something that you're going to look into in the future, or is that you're focusing just on the Christian mythology sort of?
Basically, I'm a biblical scholar, so that's where my focus is, primarily the Old Testament. Surely, this kind of critique could be applied across the board. And it is interesting that Dawkins and company tend to center on the Western religions too. And Dawkins comes out and says he frankly doesn't know much about Hinduism, Buddhism, and things like that. But what is important, and I didn't bring it up here, but our view of religion, our definition of religion in general, is primarily defined by how Christianity understands religion, i.e., a system of belief, right? Christianity, Judaism, Islam have morality built right into the system. And this is true of some Eastern religions as well, but it's not true of all. Shinto, in Japan, morality is centered not within the Shinto system itself. So if we go into studying all world religions with the way Christianity binds itself in its scope, we're really missing the mark. So one thing that comes out of this is we need to have a broad spectrum of knowledge of not only the established religious traditions, but where it's heading now. And with Wicca, with the so-called New Age stuff, with reformulations of traditional religions that are really quite radically changed from their past. So yeah, I mean that's a great question, but the problem is knowing all of that stuff. You can't learn stuff because you have to teach students. This is my, that's my excuse.
Are you familiar with any manuscripts working in non-Western religions or belief systems?
Our department has me doing Hebrew Bible, mythology, Judaism, anti-Semitism, and we've got a fellow who does, history of Christianity. But then we have, somebody studying Hinduism, as particularly goddess rituals in northern India, and then we have somebody who does Japanese Buddhism. We want to hire somebody who does Southeast Asian traditions. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot. Very few of them are focused on Western secularization as well, simply because that the predominant religions here are Christian, to a lesser extent Judaism as well. But yeah, it's very, very broad. If you went to the American Academy of Religion, you would find papers, hundreds of papers on Islam, Buddhism, all sorts of things.
I want more time to formulate it properly, but I'm going to try it. I'm going to try and get it out before it's fully articulated in my mind. But given the predominance of secular studies of the Bible and your own view that while important, certainly the Bible is not divine in the sense of believers, and the contempt that you seem to hold for the religious orthodoxy trumpeting family values, traditional marriage, creationism in our schools, and so on. Whereas I completely understand and support the desire for knowledge for its own sake, why the Bible or religious studies over the Iliad or the works of Shakespeare that also give historical insights into historical events, human psychology, and societies in different times and places?
Oh, yeah, okay, that's wonderful. That's something we all wrestle with too. And as far as I'm concerned, as a document, just from a particular people that we should be concerned about, I don't think the Bible is any more important than Epic of Gilgamesh or Bhagavad Gita or anything like that. What makes it perhaps more politically important is its role in Western society. But for me, is it really any more important a production than the Iliad? No, I don't see it as that. And in fact, I wanted to, when I decided I was going to go do religious studies instead of become a lawyer and sue anybody who cut me off in my BMW, I don't really care about other people's legal problems, I really want, two choices, either do Hebrew Bible or learn Sanskrit and study the Vedas. I went to the Hebrew Bible route simply because University of Alberta had 2 world-class scholars in the Hebrew Bible, and they taught Hebrew every year. And so, and they were great teachers too, so I sort of got led down that path. But no, I don't see any inherent value in the Bible over anything else.
So, great. I'm glad to hear that. So, given its prominence because of its social impact, what do you think is the best way for folks that just want to get on with their lives and not be impacted by the folks that you hold in equal disdain? How do we get that? How do we get to that point? You decry the media and the academics that go to the social conservatives or the religious orthodoxy that don't really represent the accurate history. You decry the new atheists' slanderous attempts and bad history to really make the gods of the trilogy old, new, and in Quran. So it's portrayed so inaccurately. So what's the way to get to a point where it's actually viewed as an important literary human creation on par with other great literary human works? I'm
not really sure, because in some ways it is viewed as superior. Even within the academia. I mean, so much of the Society of Biblical Literature is all about the beauty of the Bible and how wonderful it is. And frankly, some parts of it are so freaking boring, I don't know why I bother. But there have been some books that are pretty easy to read that can put a lot of it into a good perspective for people. Jacques Berliner Blau's The Secular Bible is quite good. It's not really an introduction into it, but he talks a lot about it as an ancient product of the ancient world and how to sort of deprivilege the religious claims about it. And there are a few other things, and I think things are going to be changing soon. The Society of Biblical Literature has starting a website. I think they're calling it the Bible Odyssey Project, which is going to be a secular introduction to where it comes from and all of that kind of thing. And there have been a few TV shows and things like that. So, this kind of thing that myself and some of my colleagues in the SBL are talking about, it's coming down, it's trying to get some serious stuff done at a level where you don't need to know Hebrew or Aramaic or Ugaritic. And I think that's going to be good. I think things are changing.